Shalom all. We come to another teaching. This one is a commentary on another video titled Christian Denomination Family Tree. The link is also in the title. The link in the title is self-explanatory. Its purpose is the building of a family tree of every major Christian denomination, as stated in the video opening introduction. I am going to give some comments with Bible references to assist your understanding of the video. Though the video covers some early schisms, it does not cover the theology of their denominations, only when breakaway divisions occurred. Schisms means a split or division between strongly opposed sections caused by difference of opinions or belief. So those are the reasons why the denominations came about, when they split from each other. But what theology they actually cover, it doesn't go into, the video doesn't go into that. However, it must be understood that with every division came a shift in theology and beliefs from his way of God, who set us the way to live, leading to and by some of those splitting from God's way, the other ways lead to hell for some and salvation for others, i.e. just one group others. One Lord, one baptism, one faith, remember it is. So some scriptures to put that in context. Genesis chapter 6 verse 12 says, "And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." So God had a way. Malachi chapter 3 verse 6, "For I am Yahweh, I change not." So that way of Yahweh is eternal. Ephesians 5 verse 6, "Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon children of disobedience." So anyone who is deceived, departed from God's way, get his wrath. And as I said, Ephesians 4 verse 5, it should be what it is: one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Numbers chapter 15 verse 16 tells us there's one law, and one manner shall be for you and for the stranger that sojourneth with you, so for all mankind. Romans chapter 15 verse 18, "For I will not," this is Paul speaking, "for I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed." So that was Paul saying he hasn't come to change anything, but to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed. And James chapter 1 verse 17, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." So God does not change his ways, moving to the left, to the right, adding nor taking away. Now, a simpler chart is found on page 68 of a book titled "Have I Got It Right, God?" It's freely available to read online or download at this link that shows there, forward to yahweh.com, images, so forth. I think it is worth drawing your attention to one major division, theology of the denominations. The one thing that separates them into two big groups. Their weekly day of worship of either what today is called Saturday and Sunday. The Saturday congregations state that they honor God's Sabbath, as recorded in Genesis chapters 2 verse 3, Exodus chapters 20 verse 8, and other Bible verses. The Sunday congregations state either the New Testament changed it, or he changed the seventh-day Sabbath, when, for example, a couple of times the apostles met on the first day of the week, and they assume that first day of the week to be a Sunday, or they rely on Jesus' resurrection, which they again say was on a Sunday because the Bible calls it the first day of the week. Now, this point is addressed more comprehensively in a short study of Mark chapter 16, which draws your attention to Mark chapter 16, verse 9. And there's a YouTube link to that video about when the first day of the week really is, and it's not Sunday. Another division is the annual days of worship. Apart from the weekly one, another clear division is the annual days of worship of congregations. Some Saturday congregations will also keep those of Leviticus 23, verse 2, where God set out his appointed times. I say Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2 and 4 says it. So Leviticus chapter 3, verse 4 says, "These are the feast," mean appointed times, "of Yahweh, even holy convocations, holy gatherings, which you shall proclaim in their seasons." Some Saturday congregations follow the Sunday congregations in the keeping of those Sunday annual days, what the Sunday denominations do, like Christmas and Easter, etc. So this makes it clear. You have two big divisions of some that gather on Saturdays and some gather on Sundays. And within the Sunday gatherers, some of them will keep Leviticus 23, God's annual holy days, and some of the Saturday groups will only keep the weekly seventh-day Sabbath, but then also do the same as the Sunday congregations and honoring the annual events of Christmas and Easter and so forth. Simplistically, a denomination's basic theology could be assumed by the days they hold as holy. So, for example, if not talking about the Christian faith, but if a faith system has a day going to say it's holy, like the Muslims, then you can know they're Muslims and they believe in Islam and so forth. So by the day people hold as holy can tell you something about what theology they're following. Deuteronomy chapter 4:19 says, God speaking, "Unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, shouldest be driven to worship them and serve them, which Yahweh thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven." So there were people who worshipped the planets, and it's from those worship of those planets on certain days that we get the words Sunday for the sun and Monday for the moon day, or those who worship the moon. Romans chapter 14, verse 5 gives an idea that people used to worship different days. One man esteemeth one day above another. Another esteemeth, in other words, holds as reverence or uplifts every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Okay, coming on to the video. I shall give time indicators of where the video mentions the point on which I am commenting. If you see, if I have, for example, 2:10, that means that equals 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the video. Okay, my first point. At 0 minutes 50 seconds into the video, Christianity says that Christianity came out of the Second Temple Judaism. Now, the Second Temple was built by Solomon, and we read about this in 1 Kings chapter 6. The books of Kings covers the period from the death of David, King David, to the captivity of Judah, which is about 970 to 560 BC. Now, Christianity did not start until at least 100 AD. So the video is kind of inaccurate, or give that the Christianity came out of Second Temple. No, it didn't. Okay? It came long after. Thus, it did not directly come out of Second Temple Judaism, but I say after a gap of 600 years. And over those 600 years, there were many previous changes. So I don't think it is giving the right impression when it says that Christianity came out of Second Temple Judaism. My second point, at 3 minutes 25 seconds into the video, it says God revealed himself to man before Abraham. Actually, I think the video says that God revealed himself um, to Abraham first. But no, that's not so. God actually revealed himself to mankind before Abraham. For example, we see in Genesis chapter 4, verse 6, it reads, And Yahweh said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth or angry? And why is thy countenance fallen? So that's and carrying verse 7, If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted. That's the event of Cain and Abel. Then we also have Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. It reads, Then began men to call upon the name of Yahweh. So obviously they got to reveal themselves to him, for them to call on his name. Christians are taught that the way of God, as stated in his laws in the Old Testament, is only for Israel, or today's Jews, as it's called, because they began with Moses and Israel. That's what they're commonly taught. God's ways were actually revealed to mankind before Abraham, as I said in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3, and chapter 7, verse 2. That gives an example of Noah knowing about clean and unclean food, for example, same as Leviticus chapter 11. God's ways and laws had to be repeated to Abraham's descendants when they came out of Egypt, because they ended up in Egypt, remained there for 430 years, and had forgotten the ways of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We read about this prophecy in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where God tells Abraham that his descendants will go into Egypt for 400 years. Basically, God's given a round number, the nearest 100 years. But in Exodus chapter 12, verse 30, it gives the exact time of 430 years. My third point, 3 minutes 53 seconds in the video. In Numbers 32, the division between Israel and Judah begins. This is when they come to the promised land, 10 tribes settle on one side of the river, and 2 tribes go across to the other side. And that's why this where the first division came of Israel and Judah. Now notice they're going after other gods is what led to the destruction of their kingdoms and captivity, as the video says. That is fornication, going after false gods, of which there's 2 types of false gods. There's idolatry, gods that are made of idols, like carvings or molten images and things like that. Or there's fornication, gods that are not made out of idols, i.e., the worship of the planets, the host of heaven. I say the number one, and going after false gods, the number one sin, as the video says, it is not unlawful sex between a man and a woman, as some people read into Matthew 5, verse 32, and I think Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Which reads, Matthew 5:32 reads, But I say unto you, this is Yeshua speaking, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for, meaning except for this one reason, and it says mention reason for the cause of fornication. Now it is also the sin that led led to Solomon's demise. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 4 to 11, where Solomon followed the pagan gods of the pagan wives that he married. Point number 4. 4 minutes 4 seconds into the video, we see in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 13 and verse 32, Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, and 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18, where Israel and Judah, the two divisions, sinned against God and the reason they went into captivity. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18 says, Therefore Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. And then the next verse, also Judah kept not the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel which they made. And the video tells you the time periods when that happened. My fifth point, comment, 5 minutes 58 seconds into the video. The return to Jerusalem to build a second temple came with Nehemiah and Ezra. We read in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 5, and in the book of Ezra, between the two of them, they rebuilt the city and the temple. Now, note this was a result of Nehemiah's prayer in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 5, Daniel chapter 9, verse 4, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 30, chapter 7, verse 9, and chapter 30, verses 3 and 10. Basically, in those, God actually said that if they go away from him and worship other gods, and when they're scattered into other foreign nations, if they basically repent and turn back to him, he would show mercy on them. And that is summarized in Exodus chapter 20, verse 6, on an individual basis, where God says, it reads, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. So that is the condition to get God's mercy. People think God's mercy or grace is free. It is not. It's clearly stated in Exodus chapter 20, verse 6. You have to be someone who loves God and keeps his commandments. And maybe you depart, you fail or depart for a little while, but then you repent. And as Luke chapter 13, verse 5, 3 and 5 said, unless you repent, you like will perish. So repentance is what brings God's mercy. So forth. My sixth point, at 6 minutes 47 seconds into the video, Greek religious beliefs incorporated former empire beliefs as those of Egypt. The Roman Empire continued incorporation of other gods' beliefs, so that by the New Testament we read of the coexistence of Rome gods and Yahweh God faiths. Was up in Acts chapter 10, verse 28, it reads, and he said unto them, you know how that it is unlawful, so how it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation, because those other nations generally worship other gods. Acts chapter 14, verse 13, then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands onto the gates and would have done sacrifice with the people. So there you see two systems there. You also remember the lady called Lydia, I think, who used to be a seller of purple, and they used to worship the goddess Diana, so forth. See also John chapter 4, verse 9, 18, verse 20, chapter 18, verse 26, Acts chapter 11, verse 3, 19, verse 35, and Galatians 2, verse 12, talk about the two coexisting faith. When I say two, major, following God and following other gods, following the Yahweh God and following other gods. My seventh point, which is at 8 minutes 49 seconds into the video, the speaker, narrator commonly calls people who use the word Christians. These were definitely not Christians. In other words, he says the first Bible believers of the New Testament were Christians. They were not Christians, though that is a common Christian replacement theology teaching. They were a new sect of Judaism named after the Messiah from Nazareth. Let's say Judaism, or what we call the Jews today. Yes, the Messiah of Nazareth was called Yeshua by his Hebrew name, but Christians commonly called him, or were wrongly called him, Jesus. John chapter 1, verse 45. Philip finds Nathanael and saith unto him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Yeshua of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So that is why they were called sect of Nazarenes, following the Messiah of Nazareth. And you remember in Deuteronomy, God told the Israelites that he would send someone from their brethren like Moses, and they were to listen to him. And that is the full. Yeshua came to fulfill that prophecy. Acts chapter 24, verse 5. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of the sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So that is what they're actually called, not Christians. And you see that is coming to the end of the book of Acts almost, chapter 24 out of chapter 26, out of 26 chapters. The Bible translators of the 16th century called them Christians because obviously at that time they were, that name was what people were calling followers of the Bible. And you see this in Acts chapter 11 verse 26 where it says they were first called Christians in Antioch. One is not necessarily what they are called by other people. That was specifically in reference to followers of Jesus, but of God. So that was not specifically in reference to Jesus, but just follower of a God, being holy people. Ask yourself this: what were they called for the previous 11 chapters if they were only first called Christians in Antioch? And note the apostles never called themselves Christians. For example, Paul, who wrote most of the fair proportion of the New Testament, he says, Paul speaking, but Paul said, I am a man with which am a Jew of Tarsus. And Paul also refers to himself as a Jew in Acts chapter 22, verse 3. I am verily a man which am a Jew. Now note at 9 minutes, 8 seconds to 40 seconds in, the narrator actually states these early Christians were Jews, because that is actually what they were. My 8th point, 9 minutes, 50 seconds in, God, Yahweh God, fearers are mentioned in the Bible as well. So what the narrator says is that these people there's those who followed God, they were either Jews or God-fearers. And I'm saying I just show you where in the Bible they were actually called God-fearers. They're either called God-fearers or proselytes. We see the word proselyte used in Acts chapter 2, verse 10, in the day of Pentecost, when many Jews and proselytes came to the day of Pentecost. Also in Acts chapter 6, verse 5, chapter 13, verse 43, and Matthew chapter 23, verse 1. But I shall give you some examples of where the Bible refers to God-fearers. Acts chapter 10, verse 1, speaking of Cornelius. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. Acts chapter 10, verse 35, Peter speaking, but in every nation he that feareth him, talking about fearing God, and worketh righteousness is accepted by him. So God-fearers. Acts chapter 13, verse 16, then Paul stood up and begged them with his hand, said, this is when Paul preaching in the synagogues, men of Israel, and you that fear God, give audience or give me your attention. Acts chapter 13, verse 26, Paul again, men and brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, i.e. the Jews, and whosoever among you feareth God, to you is the word of their salvation. So there are the God-fearers. My 9th point, once the temple was gone, the worship system became non-temple worship system, and the narrator explains that. That meant that because there was no place for the animal sacrifices, thus there was no place to hold Leviticus 16, for example, the Day of Atonement, sacrifices for the forgiveness of the sins. If you read Leviticus 16, you see what the purpose of that Day of Atonement was. That was the purpose of Messiah being the unblemished sacrifice of God to replace the corrupted animal sacrifices spoken of in Malachi. So, when the temple was destroyed after AD 70, the system that had to be followed was one of calling on the name of Yeshua as one's sacrifice. And you have to remember there was a period when they were in Babylon without the a tabernacle, a temple, that Daniel prayed at his window. So they have had a system of operation uh, when there was, similarly to when there was no temple, and they offered sacrifice of praise. Again, that's covered in the book of Hebrews, where Paul says to offer sacrifice of praise. However, although the temple was destroyed, the system that God instituted remained, and that is explained in the book of Hebrews. Humans were still required to keep part of God's laws that related to them, i.e., not to kill, not to steal, not to commit adultery, and so forth. And we see one of the list of things that the people were supposed to do in Exodus chapters 20, which people call the Ten Commandments, but it's not really the Ten Commandments because the whole list goes on until Exodus chapters 24, verses 4 to 7, where Moses wrote them all in a book, and the people made a covenant in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. But things for God was not only given to us, things that the people were supposed to follow was not only given in that section of the Bible, but in other places like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth, where God stated things that they were to do. However, I want you to specifically note in Exodus chapter 24, verse 12, after God had given the list of the things that the people are to do or not to do, God calls up Moses to receive further instructions, which the priests were to perform to gain God's forgiveness for the people's transgressions of their sins. That system was written by the finger of God in Exodus chapter 31, verse 18. So there's two parts of the law. One, what the people are supposed to do, and second part, if you read Exodus chapter 25 to 31, you see the tabernacle system there of what the priests are supposed to do. And for further study on that, follow the link on the screen, and you see a study of, was the Ten Commandments really written on stone? Because people think the Ten Commandments of Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 18, was what was written on the stones by God's finger, and it wasn't. You see, it clearly says in Exodus chapter 24, verses 4 and 7, Moses wrote that list in a book, and it's Exodus chapters 25 to 31 that God wrote on the stone, the tabernacle system. At this point, Christianity had not been formed. So it is not correct to say that Christianity came out of the New Testament. So it was at this point, at the point of the speaker's video. They were still called Jews of the sect of the Nazarenes, as I said above. Thus, do not be influenced by the replacement theology renaming of them by Christian mindset persons. To call them Christians, they were not. Now, note at 10 minutes 50 seconds in, the narrator states, as the Bible confirms, they met in synagogues. Yes, to confirm they were still Jews, practicing Jewish ways. Acts chapter 13, verse 14 and verse 42, Acts 14, verse 1, 17, verse 1, 18, verse 4, and 26, verse 11 are some examples of the scriptures that confirms they were Jews meeting in synagogues. Okay, let's come on to the period the video talks about, specifically when the Christians began to become part of the Bible history. My 10th point, 11 minutes 25 seconds in, note it says Jewish Christians followed Jewish practices as the early Christians had done. And they were called Nazarenes. Now, he also says that some of these early Jewish Christians became extinct and may have had an influence on Islam or followed. No, that's not the case. Islam's founder, Muhammad, in 600 AD, stole from Jewish and Christian beliefs to form his own system, Islam, for his personal empire building reasons. It's not that the Jewish Christians became Muslims or when created that system. It is easier to get followers to follow you, i.e. Muhammad, if you attach a God to your cause. And that's what he did. The only two faiths were around in those days, Judaism and Christianity, for which Islam, Muhammad was exposed. So he just drew on those two. Islam does not worship the same God as Jews nor Christians, and is why they hate those faiths and teach hatred towards them. Those early Nazarenes were definitely not as Muslims today. My 11th point, Pauline Christians, as a video calls them, if there is such a difference, were similar to those called Jewish Christians, sect of the Nazarenes. They simply may have misunderstood Paul's writings due to being unlearned in the Old Testament, from where Paul got his teachings. Paul cannot and did not change what God has commanded. Remember, Paul actually tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:15, and I think 2 Timothy 2:15, to study to make yourself approved. The only thing to study at that time was the Old Testament. And then Paul says that it makes you wise unto salvation through Christ. Now, Peter spoke of people who misunderstood Paul's writings, epistles. In 2 Peter chapter 3:16, it says, as also in all his epistles, speaking of Paul, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrestle, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. You, therefore, beloved, seeing you know these things before, beware lest you also, being led away with the error of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness. So the wicked are those who do not know the ways of God and try to misinterpret Paul's writings or read into his writings to form a new way. See Romans chapter 15, verse 18, and 1 Corinthians chapter 7:19 for some more teachings on that. And also the link there, which is one that says, does Paul ever contradict Jesus? And this whole study on whether Paul ever contradicted what God or Yeshua says. The Gentiles to whom Paul ministered were not natural Gentiles or foreign nations, but the scattered 10 tribes of Israel who settled in those nations. This is a big thing that Christians miss. They think that Gentiles were the natural Gentiles of foreign nations. No, there are two types of Gentiles. There's the scattered Israelites who were scattered by the Syrians and then took up residence or into those foreign nations. And then there are the natural inhabitants of those nations. And Paul actually went to the scattered Israelites of those nations, not the natural Gentiles, because that was what was prophesied in Ezekiel, I think chapter 7, for example, where God says he will reunite the two big tribes, or all 12 tribes, into one tribe under the prophesied King Yeshua. So the apostles stayed in Judea, in Jerusalem, to teach what we call the Orthodox Jews, the ones who, the Pharisees and Sadducees there. But Paul and Barnabas were sent by the Holy Spirit or by God to the scattered Israelites who were living in foreign nations to let them know about that their promised Messiah had come and died. So Paul did not go to natural Gentiles. And a teaching on that is those two links there, which is one about Cornelius, whether he was a natural Gentile or an Israelite Gentile. And then another one about the lens that we read the Bible. Sometimes Christians are taught to read it with Christian lenses or perspective, rather than the perspective of the Bible is about the group of Jews or Israelites. Unless you know the Bible or read it in the context of their history, you will get a lot of things wrong and misunderstand who are Gentiles and who are not. My 12th point is 12 minutes 51 seconds in, where Paul advocated the keeping of God's laws, of which circumcision was not a law. but a covenant sign to the seed of Abraham. We see this in Genesis chapter 17, verse 11, where God told Abraham, made a covenant with Abraham for him and his descendants. And there's a teaching on that in that link there, the end of number 12. My 13th point, the video then goes on to one of the groups that came out of the New Testament period of time, Gnostics. And Gnostics are referred to in the Bible. Some make reference to them is in, or their way they thought is 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 20, Colossians chapter 2 verse 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 18 plus Galatians chapter 1 verse 8. Galatians chapter 1 verse 8 says, but though we, Paul speaking, but though we or an angel from heaven preach any gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. So I think this could be read as in a reference to those of the Gnostic beliefs. My 14th point comes at 14 minutes 47 seconds. Again, the narrator uses the term Pauline Christianity, and he says they were the ones who won, or the battle between the three different sects of what the narrator calls Christianity. Now they evolved as the winner because the Church of Rome was able to manipulate Paul, New Testament epistles, teachings to refer to their pagan gods. Use Paul's epistles as a separation from the Old Testament. You notice many Christians today follow the New Testament, have more, what should I say, following of the New Testament than the Old Testament. I think that was for the Jews and for olden days and so forth. Notice the mention of adherents at 50 minutes 10 seconds into the video, meaning the division came for someone who supports a particular party, person, or set of ideas. But that is what the Church of Rome did. They chose what they wanted to follow from Christianity and merge it with their paganism, and then basically made a system which is called Christianity. So it's at that point that Christianity was established. The Church of Rome killed the apostles and hijacked their faith to twist it to incorporate and refer to other gods as God of Ishtar, an Egyptian god, but they camouflage it as Easter. Also the worship of the sun god Horus, on the camouflage of Christmas, 25th of December, as the Son of God, the Bible. Note the video then identifies two specific years, 313 CE and 325 CE, where Constantine had a big influence on the doctrines that Christians then was written down and what they follow. And from those two, that for around that period of time, as you see, we had a Nicene Creed, which all common Christian denominations follow to today. I shall see what part 2 of that video series teaches and comment further. If it does not follow what I think will come next, I shall add it in my second comment. Shalom, and hope you look up all the links I have posted, because they would add to your understanding of the Bible in context of some of